Lesbos, Greece, to Athens, Greece, 2015, 12 days from home. Mahud was in another tent city. The paved parking lot at the pier of Lesbos was full of the kinds of camping tents sold in the sporting goods stores. Round-topped, single-family tents of blue and green and white and yellow and red, all provided by Greek relief workers who knew the refugees had nowhere to stay while they waited for the ferry to Athens to come. Wet clothes were hung to dry on bicycle rafts and traffic signs, and refugees gathered around the camp stove and hot plates. It should have been a lively pace full of songs and laughter like the Kilos refugee camp, but instead of a soft, mournful murmur of conversation hung over the tent city like a fog. Mahud wasn't surprised. His family felt exactly the same way. They all should have been excited to finally be in Greece, to be allowed to buy real tickets to travel on an actual ferry to the mainland Europe, but too many of them had lost someone in the sea, crossing to be happy. Mahud's mother had gone from the tent to tent asking after Hana. Mahud had helped. It was his fault she was gone after all, but no one in the dock had her, and no one had been in the dinghy that had taken her. Refugees came and went, but the tents remained, and Mahud's mother insisted they miss the next ferry to Athens so she could ask each new round of refugees for the word for her daughter, but no one knew anything about her. Mahud felt sick as he head on the dinghy. He couldn't look at his mother. She had to blame him for losing Hana. He certainly blamed himself. He couldn't sleep at night. He kept picturing his sister's dinghy bursting on the rocks, Hana falling into the water. None of them there to help her. Mahud's mother wanted to stay at the dock longer and didn't want to leave without knowing what happened to Hana, but Dad told her they had to move on. There was no telling when the ferry line might suddenly decide to stop selling tickets to refugees, or when Greece might decide to send them all home. They had to keep moving or they would die. Hana had to have gone ahead of them on the morning ferry they missed the first day. Or else. No one wanted to think about the or else. The huge Athens ferry arrived again that morning. It was the length of a soccer field and at least 5 stories tall. The bottom half was painted blue, and Blue Star Ferries was written in big words on the side. A radar bar spun near the bridge, and antennas and satellite dishes sprouted from the roof. It looked like the pictures Mahud had seen of cruise ships. Its lifeboats along were bigger than the dinghy they had left Turkey in. Mahud tried to get Walid interested in the big ship, to get him excited about their first trip on a boat that big, but his little brother didn't care. He didn't seem to care about anything. A big ramp on the back lowered, and refugees streamed on the boat to the ferry. Mahud's mother wept as they climbed a ramp with the other passengers. She kept looking back over her shoulder at the tent city, hoping, Mahud was sure, to catch a glimpse of someone carrying a baby who might be Hana, but she never did. The inside of the ferry was like the lobby of a fancy hotel. Every floor had little clusters of glass tables and white upholstered chairs. Snack bars sold chips and sweets and sodas, and TVs played a Greek soccer game. Refugees had still had belongings stuffed their backpacks and trash bags under tables into the overhead compartments. Mahud and his family settled into one of the booths, and his father searched for a plug to charge his phone. Mahud, why don't you take your brother and explore the ship? Dad told him. Mahud was too glad to get away from the sight of his mother's broken face, and he took Walid by the hand and pulled him out into the promenade that ran around the outside of the ship. Mahud and Walid watched silently as the ferry pulled away from the dock, the ship's huge ensign shimmering through the deep below. The awful sea that had tried to swallow them was calm and sapphire blue now. The Greek island of Lesbos was actually beautiful when you saw it from the sea. Little white buildings with terracotta roofs rose up tree-covered hills, and on the top of the hills was an ancient gray castle. Mahud could see why people visited there on vacation. Besides the refugees, there were a number of tourists on board. Mahud could tell they weren't refugees because they wore clean clothes and used their phones for taking pictures instead of looking up overland routes from Athens to Macedonia. Another refugee had laid out a map on the deck, and he was praying. In all the bustle of waiting in line and getting on board, Mahud had lost track of what time it was, and he pulled his brother down with him to pray alongside the man. As he kneeled and stood, Mahud was supposed to be focused only on his prayers, but he couldn't help notice the uneasy looks the tourists were giving them, the frowns of displeasure, like Mahud and his brother and this man were doing something wrong. The vacationers dropped their voices, and even though Mahud couldn't understand what they were saying, he could hear their disgust in their words. This wasn't what the tourists had paid for. They were supposed to be on holiday, seeing ancient ruins and beautiful Greek beaches, not stepping over filthy, praying refugees. They only see us when we do something they don't want us to do, Mahud realized. The thought hit him like a lightning bolt. When they stayed there, they were supposed to be in the ruins of Aleppo or behind the fences of a refugee camp. People could forget about them. But when refugees did something they didn't want them to do, when they tried to cross the border into their country or slept on the front stoops of their shops or jumped in front of the cars or prayed on the decks of the ferries, that's when people couldn't ignore them any longer. Mahmoud's first instinct was to disappear below decks, to be invisible. Being invisible in Syria had kept him alive, but now Mahmoud began to wonder if being invisible in Europe might be the death of him and his family. If no one saw them, no one could help them, and maybe the world needed to see what was really happening here. It was not hard to see the refugees in Athens when Mahmoud got there. Syrians were everywhere in the streets and hotels and markets, most of them, like Mahmoud's family, planning to move on as soon as they could. Mahmoud's father thought he had the right documents to travel freely to Greece, but a woman at the immigration office told him he would need to go to a local police station first to get an official document, and the police told him he would have to wait up to a week. "We can't wait a week," Mahmoud's father told the family. They had found a hotel for 10 euros a night per person, and the people of Athens were very friendly and helpful. But Mahmoud knew his parents only had so much money, and they still had 4 countries to cross before they reached Germany. Mahmoud's mother would have stayed a week or even longer to keep asking everyone she met if they had seen a baby named Hana, but it was decided. They would take a train to the border of Macedonia and try to sneak across during the night. Joseph, page 216, just outside Havana Harbor, 1939, 21 days from home. Joseph watched from the deck as another little boat snuck through the flotilla of reporters and fruit sellers and Cuban policemen surrounding the MS St. Louis. This boat held a familiar-looking passenger, and Joseph realized with it at start was a Dr. Abur, Renata and Evelyn's father, who had already lived in Cuba. Joseph ran through the ship until he found the sisters in the movie theater watching serials. "Your dad is coming to the ship," Joseph told them. Renata and Evelyn hurried after him. When they got back to the ladder at sea deck, they got an even bigger surprise. Dr. Aber had gotten on board the St. Louis. Officer Pardon was looking over some papers Dr. Aber had brought with him, and a small crowd had gathered to see what was happening. Renata and Evelyn ran to their father, and he swept them in his arms. "My beautiful daughters," he said, kissing them both. "I thought I'd never see you again." Officer Padron nodded and said something in Spanish to Dr. Aber, and Dr. Aber smiled at his daughters. "Come, it's time for you to join me in Cuba." "But what about our things, our clothes?" Renata asked. "Forget about them. We'll buy you new clothes in Cuba," Dr. Aber said. His eyes darted to the policeman, and Joseph understood. Somehow Dr. Aber had gotten someone official to let him come get his daughters off the ship, but he didn't want to wait around any longer in case the policemen changed their minds. He carried Renata and Evelyn to the ladder, and Renata barely had time to yell goodbye to Joseph and wave before they were gone over the side. Joseph was speechless, but the rest of the crowd wasn't. Angry passengers surrounded Officer Padron and the other policemen, demanding answers. "How come they get off the ship and not us? Can you help us? How did they do it? Let us off the ship. My husband is in Cuba." "They have papers. Write papers." Officer Padron tried to explain in broken German, but that only made the crowd madder. "We have papers, visas. We paid for them." Joseph was scared for Officer Padron, but he shared the passengers' frustrations. Why had Dr. Aber been able to take Renata and Evelyn off and none of the rest of them could go? It wasn't fair. Joseph clenched his fist and began to shake. Then he realized it wasn't him that was doing the shaking. It was the metal deck of the ship. The ship's engines were rumbling to life for the first time since they had dropped anchor, which could mean only one thing. The St. Louis was going home to Germany, and they were all going with it. Without one word from anyone, the passengers rushed to the top of the ladder as one. Officer Padron drew his pistol, and Joseph gasped. "Perrin!" the police cried. "Halt!" He swept the gun back and forth, and the other policemen drew their pistols and did the same. The angry passengers pulled back but didn't run away. Joseph's heart was in his throat. Any second now the mob was going to attack the policemen. Joseph knew it. They would rather die than be sent back to Germany, back to Hitler. The ship's first officer and purser arrived and threw themselves in between the guards and the angry crowd. They begged for everyone to remain calm, but no one listened. As the vibrations of the ship's engines grew louder and more insistent, more people rushed to the ladder to demand to be left off the ship. Joseph was caught in the middle now. If the mob pushed forward into the guns of the policemen, Joseph would have no choice to be pushed with them. It was hot, well over 100 degrees on deck already, and the temperature of the crowd was rising. Joseph was a ball of sweat, and the close-packed mob only made things worse. The situation was just about to boil over when a small white man in a gray suit climbed up the ladder behind the policeman. It was Captain Schroeder, but Joseph wondered why he was out of uniform, and why had he been off the ship? For a moment, the mob was so surprised it stood surging forward. Captain Schroeder was surprised, too. As soon as he saw the angry crowd and the guns drawn, he lost his temper. He yelled at the policemen to lower their weapons or he would order them off the ship, and at last, they obeyed. "Why have the engines started?" one of the passengers yelled. "Tell us what's happening." Captain Schroeder put his hands in the air and called for calm so that he could explain. He took off his hat and mopped his brow with his handkerchief. I have just been to see President Brew to appeal to him personally for you to be allowed to disembark, the captain said, but he would not see me. There were dark mutterings among the passengers, and Joseph felt himself getting angrier. What was going on? Why had the Cubans promised the passengers they would be let them in and then only turn them away now? Worse, Captain Schroeder said. The Cuban government has ordered us to leave the harbor by tomorrow morning. Leave by tomorrow? Joseph thought. And go where? What about his father? Would he be leaving with him? Cries of anger came from the passengers, and Joseph joined in. The first officer had disappeared briefly, but now returned with more sailors in case there was more violence. Joseph wondered if he should bring his mother to hear this news, but he knew she was in the cabin, most likely in bed, crying. She blamed herself for her husband's suicide attempt. In the last 2 days she had become, in a way, as absent as a parent as Joseph's father. No, Joseph was the one who needed to be here right now, for his mother and for Ruthie. Captain Schroeder called for quiet again. We are not going home. We will cruise the American coast and make appeals to President Roosevelt. If any of you have friends or family in the States, I beg you to ask them to exert what can influence they have. No matter what, I assure you, I will do everything in my power to arrange a landing outside Germany. Hope must always remain. Now please, go back to your cabins. I must return to the bridge to make the ship ready for departure. The crowd mobbed the captain as he tried to leave sea deck, the passengers pushing and shoving their way around Joseph. Joseph fought his way to the passenger who had translated for Officer Pardon the other day and pulled him where the policemen stood. What about my father? Joseph asked the officer. I saw him in the hospital, the policeman told Joseph. He's not well enough to come on the ship. Then can we go get him instead? Joseph asked. The policeman looked pained. I'm sorry, little man, you cannot leave the ship. But the ship is leaving, Joseph said. He could feel the pulsing engines under his feet. We can't leave my father behind. I wish from the bottom of my heart that you will land soon, little man, Officer said. I'm sorry, I'm just doing my job. Joseph looked deep into Officer Padron's eyes, searching for some sign of help, some hint of sympathy. Officer Padron just looked away. Joseph was still standing there in the hot Cuban sun when, right before lunch, the policeman left on a launch. Officer Padron still wouldn't look at him. Once the little boat was clear, the MS St. Louis blew its horn, raised its anchor, and left the Havana harbor. Destination unknown. As he stood at the rail with the rest of the passengers, saying a tearful goodbye to the only place they'd ever promised them Refugee, Joseph said goodbye to his father as well. He took his shirt collar in both hands and ripped it along the seam, rending his garment as he'd done when Professor Wheeler had been buried at sea. Joseph knew Papa was still alive, but it didn't matter. His father was dead to his family, and so, Joseph realized, was their dream of joining him in Cuba.